There we go. Well, first, I want to thank Lori for inviting me to give this presentation. And I'm not sure who exactly is hosting this meeting, but I want to thank Steve especially for setting up this and so many of the other Zoom presentations. And I want to thank all of you for kind of taking a risk of zooming into a presentation which is going to be a little different, well, a lot different than what we usually have. We usually have some just excellently researched, very detailed presentations on specific topics. Today, I want to tell a story, and the story is about the personal story. It's how I became interested in the club and even did a little bit of writing for the log. So I put together 21 slides and with about 100 naval related illustrations that hopefully will be entertaining and maybe a little bit humorous at some points. So I'm going to get started. About 65 plus years ago, I started my collecting career. And like so many people, and Lori and I were just discussing, I began with coins and I began with Lincoln cents. And fairly early on in my collecting career, I got interested in something called error coins. Error coins are unique coins that are made when the mint makes a mistake and strikes a coin wrong. For example, in the top left-hand corner, there is a 1998 Lincoln cent struck off center. And over to its right is a 1970 mint coin that was double struck at the Denver Mint. So there's a little D there. But what I really became interested in very early on is varieties. And varieties are coins that are struck properly, but they're struck using a die that was made incorrectly. So, for example, in the bottom left-hand corner, you see a mint mark that looks doubled. And in fact, it is doubled. The mint employee who was supposed to punch the D into the die pinched it twice and his hand jiggled a little bit. So we have kind of a double D there. So when that happens, it means that every single coin made by that die, about 100,000, maybe 200,000, comes out looking like that. Or even more interesting, over on the right-hand side is a 1944 D over S, a coin that probably occurred when late in 1944, the Denver Mint ran out of dies. So it, rather than make a very expensive die, it called the folks in San Francisco and said, have any extra dies? And they said, yes, we have some, but they've already got an S punched into them. They said, don't worry about it. Send them to us and we'll grind off the S and we'll punch a D over it. Well, the guys who did the grinding didn't do a very good job. So you get a very nice 1944 D over S. And there's probably 100,000, 200,000 of these out there for those of us who are willing to put a loop on coins from 1944 that we see. So this interest in variety of coins unsuspectingly followed me for over a half century and began and even showed up in my stamp collecting, which I'm going to show a little bit later. While I was busy collecting coins, without much knowing it, I began to, well, in fact, I became the victim of what I call hobby creep. And you may recognize the same occurring in your collecting history. What happened was I just started accumulating a whole lot of other stuff along with my coins. Almost unknown to me, I was just buying stuff. I was particularly interested in World War II era things. So I started buying World War II era magazines. For example, in the top left-hand corner, you'll see an issue of Collier's, which was in print from about 1938 to 1958, kind of a Life magazine type publication. And this one I picked to show you because it has a very nice picture of Admiral Halsey on it. Another type of magazine that I became interested in are magazines called pulps. Down in the bottom left-hand corner, you'll see an example of a pulp. Pulps were magazines that were about the size of a comic book, but maybe 4 or 5 times as thick. And they contained action-oriented stories for which the authors received about a penny, penny and a half a word. And for some reason, their covers were always lively, sometimes even lurid and very colorful, but they were created just a little bit, maybe a quarter of an inch, 3/8 of an inch bigger than the pages inside. So these are very hard to find without really ragged covers. But the reason they're called pulps is that the paper that they were printed on was extremely inexpensive because it was hard to get good paper during the war. And it had a very high pulp content, so much so that the paper almost is wooden. When you find them today, you have to be very careful because they just literally crumble in your hands. I put a picture of one of my favorites, Don Winslow of the Navy, very popular magazine during World War II. I also began collecting railroad timetables, and I'm not sure why I started amassing these. I think it might have been because my father was in the Army Air Force, and when he would come home to see me he was traveling from Texas to Pennsylvania, where I was born, he would tell these great stories of things that occurred on his trains. So I would get a timetable, for example, this Atlantic coastline, which served the eastern seaboard. And I also acquired this one for the Olympian, which was a railroad that served the Northwest and the Midwest. Of course, postcards started appearing in my house too, somehow. For example, this one below the timetables is a photo postcard that was blue tinted, and it shows the guys at the telephone center at the U.S. National Training Center, U.S. Naval Training Center in Sampson, New York. The one on the right is a postcard that was created by the War Finance Division of the U.S. Department of Treasury. It shows a ship at sea, a nice painting of a ship at sea in battle. And this postcard was created in order to promote the purchase of war bonds. So I was collecting things almost without knowing about it in the background while I was collecting stamps. And of course, I couldn't start amassing things without including some stamps. Now, initially, as I began to include stamps, I was what I think somebody called a kitchen table philatelist, where you buy a whole bunch of stamps in a plastic or cellophane bag, and then you take them home and spread them out on your kitchen table and sort them however you'd like to sort them, by country, by color, whatever you enjoyed doing at that time. So I was just amassing stamps and putting them in bags for no apparent reason, when I finally said, I'm not going to really stop and think about what I want to do if I'm going to be a stamp collector. So I decided that I'd always enjoyed Albert Einstein, and he's always been an inspiration to me. And I had even bought a couple of his manuscripts, which I have framed and have been taking with me to every office I've ever had since, I think, about 1980. So I said, I'm not going to write anything. I'm just going to collect. I'm going to make a collection of postage stamps that depict Albert Einstein. After all, how many could there be? Maybe 2 dozen, 3 dozen. So this way I could have a really nice collection of something that I enjoyed, and pretty fast because there just weren't a lot of them. Well, 400 stamps later, and 100 different countries later, I had quite a collection and decided, why not write a book? So I got a hold of the American Topical Association, and we made a book, not particularly creatively, entitled Albert Einstein on Stamps, a catalog. And the American Topical Association published it. To give you an example of some of the stamps in it, I put a few on the right. There's one from Fiji, which issued a nice little series of Albert Einstein at 4 different ages. And this is Einstein as a child. On the right is a stamp that was issued by Cuba, which has a nice caricature of Albert Einstein, and it was issued to commemorate the 75th anniversary of his visit to that island nation. On the bottom left is just a real stern Albert Einstein. I'm not sure he was ever this stern. Maybe his students saw him like this occasionally, but Poland decided that it would use this picture of him. And on the right is one of 2 stamps issued by the United States that honor Albert Einstein. This particular one was issued in 74 as a commemoration of the 100th anniversary of his death. And it's based on a photograph taken by Herman Landorf, who went to his Einstein study in Princeton and interviewed him and took pictures of him wearing a nice cable knit sweater. Having published that book on Albert Einstein, it was fairly easy then to do a little more publishing. And this time I got a hold of the American First Day Cover Society, and we published a couple of more books. Actually, they're more booklets. And what they are is booklets of all of the first day covers that I could find for each of the stamps. And so the one on the top is all of the first day covers that I could find for the birth commemorative stamp. And then on the bottom is one for an earlier stamp issued in 1966 as part of the Prominent Americans series. And while I was writing these books, I learned something which I didn't know about Albert Einstein, and that is he was a sailor. And you'll see that in the cover on the top left here. This is a cover. It's cachet made by an unknown cachet maker, but I know that the photograph was taken by a woman by the name of Lottie Jacoby. And Lottie Jacoby went to Einstein's house at the time he lived in a little town called Capeth that was on a lake. And she spent a couple of days with Einstein just taking casual pictures of him. I have a nice one with him and his wife in their pajamas. But this one is of Captain Einstein on board his sailboat, a little one-cabin sailboat, which he enjoyed being on very much. It is a sailboat that he called the Tumlar, which means porpoise in German. And it was a source of great joy to him. Unfortunately, shortly after Lottie Jacoby visited him at his lakeside house, Einstein left for California, where he was slated to give he was going to spend 6 months there teaching at Caltech. And I say unfortunately, because while he was gone, the Nazis confiscated his property and his sailboat. And Einstein realized that it wasn't safe to go back to Germany, so he finished up at Caltech for a semester, and then he took a job at Princeton, and he stayed in that job at the Center for Advanced Study until he died in 1955. On the right is a color pencil drawing by a friend of mine, Rachel Kaiser, and it's just a drawing based on that photo that Lottie Jacoby took of Albert Einstein on board his sailboat. In the bottom left is a cover by Globe, and it shows Einstein in a not too well done sketch, but in the background we see some of the things that Einstein liked. We see his violin, for example, and over at about 9 o'clock, we see a sailboat. I'm not sure his sailboat was quite that big, but it does show his interest. And on the right is a cover, first day cover created by the House of Farnham, which does not have a sailboat on it, but it has a very nice, not a quote, but just a nice phrase that says, sailing was as good as walking when he wanted to think out a problem. So I'm sort of now moving toward the sea. I'm moving from Einstein onto the water a little bit. Having published that Einstein book, I was pretty proud of myself, not necessarily without without good reason, to be honest. My book on Einstein is still available on Amazon, and it's held its original price, $29.95, and it's even on their bestsellers list. Sits about at number 3,704,000. So for better or for worse, I was feeling pretty good about myself. So I decided to do a vanity book. I had become very interested in April of 1945, primarily because that's the month I was born, in April of 1945. And although I didn't know it at the time, April of 1945 was to be a very important month in the history of our country. One person who wrote a whole book on the month called it the hinge of history. And it was a very important month because of the events that occurred in the month. For example, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt died on April 12th of 1945. Italy's Il Duce was killed by by partisans from his own country on April 28th, 1945. And of course, on April 30th, 1945, Der Fuhrer, the head of Germany, committed suicide. So in addition to those three deaths, we began our invasion of Okinawa on April 1st of 1945. On April 25th, 1945, the United Nations Peace Conference began in San Francisco, and basically that was the formation of the United Nations. And in between, some other interesting thing happened. For example, the Congress raised the United States debt ceiling to an unheard of $300 million, which is about 1% of what our debt ceiling is today. And my favorite event, in addition to my birthday on April 1st, which was not only April Fool's Day, but also was Easter Sunday, a Canadian sniper by the name of Leo Major single-handedly liberated the Dutch city of Zwolle by simply walking into the city and convincing the occupying Nazis that they were surrounded, which they weren't. He gathered them all up and he bunched them back to the line, and the city now has a main plaza named after him for single-handedly freeing their city. I picked a few covers from my book that had naval themes to them. What I did in the book, by the way, is I just went day by day. I started with April 1st, and I talked about things that occurred during that day, and then I illustrated, in a sense, those events with what I was to later learn were naval covers. And I had maybe 12 or 15 covers for each day of the month. So up in the top right-hand corner is, I think, a nice cover by A.M. Roberts of Hamburg, New York. It's sort of in the loose lips sink ships genre. In the middle are a couple of covers by one of my favorite cover makers by the name of Matthew Huss of Evanston, Illinois, with artwork by Diana Postel, who may or may not have been his wife. It's hard to know who she was, but she's done a lot of nice work for him. On the left is a patrol torpedo cruiser, and Admiral Halsey comes back in Diana Postel's cachet on the right. And on the bottom is just a nice floating firepower cachet that I like because it has sort of a nice um, woodcut look to it. And I happen to like that a lot. And this cover on the bottom is by J.C. von Lossberg of Brooklyn, New York. And just for the fun of it, here's a few more covers from my book. These are kind of cartoon covers. Up in the top left is a cover postmarked in April 1945, done by Al Fertig, which shows a sailor rushing to send mail. And on the right is a cover by Proto Cover, showing a sailor rushing to deliver the mail. On the left is a cover with an interesting little drawing by Arthur Christensen of the U.S. Army, and he belittles the Japanese Navy as nothing but a bunch of little seahorses congregating around a bunch of sunken ships. And over on the left is a similar theme where A.M. Roberts belittles Mussolini as having a fleet of ships which are nothing more than just little toy boats. And even then, Mussolini is keeping them in hiding. And on the bottom, there are a couple covers I like because I think they reflect the optimism that the country was feeling toward the end of the war in April of 1945. A sailor enjoying himself on a little lifeboat. And a cover on the right, which I have to thank Mel Dick for helping with this. I got a hold of Lori, he got a hold of Mel, and Mel contacted me and gave me a little story on this cover. This cover I had listed in my collection is by Walter Crosby, but it looked nothing like any cover that I had seen by Crosby. There was no little photograph on it. And so I asked Mel what it was about. And he said, well, the story behind this is that the fellow who drew this, and his name is on the cover in the bottom right, Ralph Shorty Burkholder, was one of Crosby's employees. So although this was published by Walter Crosby, the artwork is by Shorty Burkholder, one of the employees in one of Walter Crosby's stores. So my book on patriotic covers, by the way, is also still available on Amazon. It is not selling at its original $29.95. It has been slightly discounted to $5.95. But it too is on the Amazon bestsellers list. And it is sitting pretty solid around number 6,053,000. So I have my books out there. And now we start coming a little closer to what we collect. In the process of collecting these patriotic covers and putting my book together, I started finding these covers that weren't patriotic covers, but they were colorful and interesting. And they were postmarked in April of 1945. They weren't in Sherman's book of covers, but I liked them. And they talked about things that I didn't understand much, like keel layings or launchings or commissionings. In any case, being a collector, I started accumulating them. I just thought I'll put them aside. And when I finish the book I'm on, I'm going to take a little time. I'm going to find out what these things are and who might collect these sort of things. And as you could guess, this is what led me to our club. And I began to find out there was a whole bunch of you out there who enjoy this sort of thing and were very happy to help me realize that what I was doing is I was accumulating naval event covers. And for example, this one in the top left, which is it was sponsored by William Spader, whose name shows up on a lot of these um, naval event covers, and it's for USS 436, which subsequently was named USS Unicorn. And this is a cover that is postmarked at Groton, Connecticut, right at the shipyards. On the right is a cover that I like because it is much more detailed than most of these covers are. It is a cover commemorating the ship launching at the Bethlehem Steel Company at Quincy Yard in Quincy, Mass. And it commemorates the launching of the USS Helena. And this cover was sponsored by Mrs. John H. Heighton. And the bottom is a kind of a dynamic color which cover, which was canceled at Portsmouth for the commissioning of the aircraft carrier USS Boxer. So I now had a whole new area of interest that I didn't know what to do with, other than I now had a way to learn about them. I had some people maybe to help me, and I had these covers to do something with. While I was doing all this, I was also doing a lot of writing. And I was writing for a number of magazines. I wrote for First Days, which is the magazine of the First Day Cover Society, doing some things, especially with Einstein first day covers. Did a couple articles for the Military Postal History Society, mainly on covers that contain caricatures of Adolf Hitler. And of course, Topical Times, the ATA, had helped me, and I did some things for them. Again, a lot of stuff on Einstein. And I particularly enjoyed writing for the little magazines that were published by the study groups of the American Topical Association. For those of you who aren't topical collectors, the ATA has, gosh, I don't know, 3 dozen, 4 dozen, what they call study groups, small groups of collectors who collect thematic stamps. And almost all of them publish maybe a quarterly or once every 2 months magazine. Because I like to eat, I joined the study group that collected food on stamps. And I wrote a couple of pieces for the Philatelic Gourmet, which comes once every quarter. And I like to drink with the things I eat. So I joined the little group called Wine on Stamps, and they published a little publication called the Philatelica. And I did some pieces for them for some reason on Portuguese wines, which I was interested for a while. But what I really enjoyed publishing it most of all was in a little magazine called Philatelia Chimica et Physica, which was a study group that collected chemistry and physics on stamps. I was a horrible science student in high school and college, and I thought, well, maybe I can teach myself chemistry and physics by way of stamps. So I wrote a few dozen articles for them, everything from Albert Einstein and the Nobel Prize to gravitational waves, all sorts of stuff that appear on stamps that might make an interesting article. In fact, the one I show on this slide, it was a piece I wrote on the history of safety matches. And I chose this because this is the only cover I have ever gotten. So I have to show it off a bit. So being a bit of a writer and now knowing about the USCS, I had a new goal. And my goal was, I'm going to publish something in the log, which was not as easy as it might sound because I had a couple of big problems. And my first problem was I really knew nothing about the Navy the Merchant Marine, the Coast Guard, or the Marines. Not a thing. And I didn't really even do well around water. I get sick on cruise ships, seasick. So I didn't have a lot of knowledge. And closely related to that is I lived in great fear of being discovered. I just knew that I was going to write something and send it in, and I was going to call a ship a he or an it, or not put something in capital letters that should be in capital letters. I was going to confuse starboard with port. Basically, I was going to make some gaffe that was going to expose me as the landlubber that I really am. So I thought, how am I going to accomplish my goal and also not reveal myself? So I put together a very short little piece and more of a filler, hoping that somebody could use a filler. And after I did that, I thought, I'm still not comfortable with it. I've got to find somebody who knows what they're talking about, some expert who can read this and make sure that I sound like I know what I'm doing a little bit, and I'm not publishing some real big gaffe. So I was very fortunate. I had recently joined the Motor City Stamp and Cover Club in Detroit, and I had met quite a guy named Bob Quintero. And so I prevailed upon Bob and I said, would you read this and let me know whether I should send it in? Now, the mention of Bob is going to take me off to the side just a little bit because Bob, as I think many of you probably know him who collect in this area, was a great cover maker of covers having to do with submarines, but he was probably equally well known for his Q-Maids. And maybe just one slide on Bob's Q-Maids. These are all by Bob Quintero. And the top left is a cover that he created for the commissioning of the submarine USS Chicago on September 27th. On the right is a 1987 cover that commemorates the 10th anniversary of the commissioning of USS Baton Rouge. And on the bottom, I think this is a 1987 cover that commemorates the 10th anniversary of the commissioning of USS Memphis. And over on the left is one of Bob's drawings that commemorate the commissioning of the USS Seawolf in 1997. Bob was quite a guy, and unfortunately we lost Bob about 3 years ago. But if you're interested in Bob and you're interested in the Q-Maids and the submarines, Steve Shea wrote a very nice tribute to him that is on the Naval Cover Museum website, and you can learn a little bit more about a crusty old guy who's really a pretty terrific guy in our hobby, Bob Quintero. Well, getting back to my little article that Bob said, send it in, it can't hurt. It was not much of an article, it was more like a list. And what I did is I stuck with something that was familiar, namely April 1945. And what I did was, without any books or resource material that I now know is available, I just found a list of every ship that was launched during that month. And for each ship, I put a photo of that ship and I put one cover that I had for that ship. So it was more of a list than an article, but I thought, send it in. The less words I have, the less chance I have of making a gaffe. And I sent it in and I got very good news that it was going to appear in the log. The editor at that time, Richard, said, this might be an interesting way of collecting that people hadn't thought about, so I'm going to put this in. So up in the top left, or on the top, is a nice cover, again by William Spader, sponsored by him, that was created for the launching of the USS Cobbler on my birthday, April 1st, 1945. And in the middle is a cover that was sponsored by the Tacoma Chamber of Commerce and signed by their chair at the time, or president. And it was created to uh, commemorate the launching of the USS Sicily, an aircraft carrier. And on the bottom is a nice cover commemorating the launching of the destroyer USS Guyot, also in April of 1945. So, as you can imagine, I was thinking pretty highly of myself at this point. And I thought, if I did this, I could do another one. So I thought, might as well stick close to the topic. They tell you in business school, stay close to the product. So what I did was I put together another quick little article. And this time I not only went with April 1945, but I went with that theme that I had really a half century before on varieties. And what I realized was, I didn't have the vocabulary that most of you have now to understand these things, that there were different covers for the same event. For example, I had this really nice cover on the top by an unknown cover maker for the launching of the USS Cucino, and I had another one on the bottom that was also commemorating the same event. And I think, Lori, you mentioned this in your talk on fish on submarines. So I had a couple, which certainly wasn't a whole lot of varieties, but I thought, there's different ways of thinking of varieties. So what I did is I picked the cover on the bottom, which was again sponsored by William F. Spader and the ANCS Argonauts. And I expanded my idea of varieties, and I sent in another article. And what I did on this one is I claimed that there was varieties in cachet colors and franking. Now, I've simply since learned that different cachet colors is not the big deal I thought it was. Basically, printers use for small things like this whatever ink they have available. I also noticed that when my printer begins to run out of black ink, the green and blue sort of change to these colors you see. So it might have been somebody just forgetting or not putting a little black ink in there. In any case, I thought that this was interesting. And I also thought that the franking sent a message or something. And so I put this one together, and it also appeared in log, and I was very happy. I subsequently learned that probably people who send these covers out just use whatever postage they happen to have on hand. And what I thought was intentional varieties probably wasn't, nor was it as clever as I thought it was at the time that I sent this in. However, I do think maybe putting a stamp like in the bottom middle with a locomotive on a event cover having to do with a submarine might be considered clever. So I sent it in. Again, Richard was very good. Richard Jones, the log editor, and he said, sure, we'll put this in print too. So at this point, I really thought I was a great writer, at least pretty good or something. And of course, I do what other great writers did. I just stuck with the theme. And this time, I stayed with April 1945. And this time I picked a ship called the Intimidor. Now, I picked the Intimidor because this is a fish, I believe, that is part of the I think it's the stingray uh, um, family, and this electric ray family. And this fish is known to be found mainly off the coast of Baja California. And Baja California had a connection with me because in 1980, I, for some reason that I'm still not sure of, quit my job and moved to Mexico, where I took a house on 28 acres of sand dunes with no electricity and no water, and decided I was going to write the great American novel. Somebody had convinced me that everyone has at least one great novel in them. So I went down there by myself, and I spent a year by myself in this house writing a really bad novel that when I got back to the States, nobody wanted to publish. But it was a good year. I often say that it cost me about $50,000, and all I had to show for it is my mental health. It was a good year, and so here I had a fish that I related to, I had a month that I related to, and I put together another one of my quote varieties articles. The varieties were various in franking, but I don't think the colors were all that great. In any case, it appeared in the log. I was achieving my goal. In fact, I was one night bragging to my wife. I said, I think I'm pulling it off. I think people must think that I maybe was in the Navy or something, or I'm doing a pretty good job at this. And my wife is a fairly straight talker. And her response was, I really don't think you are. And I said, why not? She said, because you haven't written anything substantial. And I thought, that's right. I have met my goal of putting something in the log, but I've got to write something substantial so I can really say that I have written something for our magazine. So very fortunately, I had a little mix up on the internet on a purchase. And as a result of the mix up, I had a chance to buy a bunch of memorabilia from a ship that was not launched in April 1945, called the Vela Gulf. And the Vela Gulf I'd never heard of, didn't fit any of my themes, but I thought maybe I could do something substantial about this. So I bought all these things. I bought a first day cover signed by the head of the Tacoma Chamber of Commerce, who I knew about from writing a little earlier. I got a nice invitation to the commissioning ceremony. I got the first issue of the Vela Guff, which was the ship's newspaper. I got a nice picture of the Vela Gulf, and I have a picture too of the captain, which I don't have here. And I got a very nice 1 year anniversary cash cover down on the bottom middle. But what I really got that really hit the jackpot was a hand-drawn map. And this hand-drawn map, I don't know who did it. He only called himself Eager Beaver. And he just drew the entire voyage of the Vela Gulf. And he annotated it with official events and unofficial events. For example, he puts in here, swam on the beach in Waikiki and drank 2 cold beers at the breakers in Hawaii. So I now had all this really nice material, and it was a fairly easy next step to write sort of a history of the ship story and send it in. And if I could get this one published, I would be able to meet my wife's criteria. So before sending it in, of course, I had it checked by her, had it checked by my neighbor who landed a lot of planes on carriers. I had it checked by Bob Quintero. I had it checked by a classmate of mine who taught military history. And after I stalled with all these checks, I sent it in. And I was fortunate. It not only was published in our magazine, but it won an award that year for um, an article in the log. And with that award came a certificate, which I very quickly framed and put on my wall, and a $25 check, which I almost framed and put on the wall too. But then I thought, wait, this will be the first money I have ever earned. And with the cashing of this check, I'm now making my living, since I'm retired, as an author. So I quickly cashed it and became then even more proud of myself because I was now making my living as a writer. I thought, fairly easy to do. I'll just get another $25. And the way I'll do this is I'll just write another article for the log. So this time I thought, I got to really go somewhere I haven't been before. And no April stuff, no varieties. I'm going to write something that I have a connection to, but not the kind of connection I've been exploiting up until now. Well, I grew up in Southern California, and I was about 10 or 11 when Disneyland opened. And when you grew up in Southern California in those days in the 50s, you go to Disneyland once or twice a year. It was affordable. It's where you took all the visitors who came to see you from the East or to go to Disneyland. And so I went to Disneyland a lot. And my favorite ride in Disneyland was 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And contrary to the picture on the bottom left, it did not really, the submarine didn't really leave. It just stayed where it was, and the water bubbled up in front of your window, and it was very exciting. And so I thought, I like this, and I thought maybe I can write something about this. So I picked the USS Redfish. USS Redfish was a submarine that was launched along with three other submarines in January of 1944. And she had a nice career. She received 2 battle stars and a Presidential Unit Celebration citation. She had a good World War II service at the end of the war, but she caught her big break later when she was asked to star in the movie 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which starred Kirk Douglas and a whole bunch of other famous people. But I thought I would add this little souvenir sheet that honors Kirk Douglas, a souvenir sheet from Mali. And you see in the bottom there the submarine, the great scene where it's attacked by the giant squid. So the USS Redfish was selected to play the nuclear-powered submarine owned by Captain Nemo, and she was renamed the Nautilus. Now you're thinking, how can this be? You got a bullet-shaped submarine, and then you've got Captain Nemo's submarine as pictured on the bottom left postcard from Disneyland. Well, it was fairly easy to do. They just shot the shots from far away, and everything looked like kind of a little gray blob moving around. But they did have to, at one point, do a little bit of work on the submarine. So for a scene in which Kirk Douglas's character and his pals are left on board the top of the submarine as it goes down to die, they did have to do a large mock-up on the Nautilus afterdeck. And so you see a kind of a prosthetic or a prop sitting on top of the USS Redfish in the black and white photo in the middle. Redfish ended its career. It stayed, by the way, in Hollywood because people liked what Redfish did in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Hollywood decided to use it in another movie called Run Silent, Run Deep. And that is a movie that starred Burt Lancaster and Clark Gable. Burt Lancaster, who I misidentified in my article as Kirk Douglas, but in any case, it was 20,000. It was again another role in which he played a nuclear-powered submarine. This time, I think it was called the. Let me take a look at my notes here and see. Oh, it was called the Nikita, I believe. And they did the same thing. They did a lot of distance shots. And whenever they had to make it look like a nuclear powered submarine or ran into difficult, they just built a giant tank in the United Artists Studios, which I happened to see when I was a kid touring there, because that's another thing you did when people visited you from the East. You took them on a movie studio tour, and they used models. And so it then played another nuclear powered submarine and finally ended up its career with a number of guest visits on a television series. And this television series was called The Silent Service. And this is an article from it. What they would do each week on Fridays is do a show about a submarine. And it was admired. It was narrated by an admiral, and whenever they needed a kind of fill-in submarine, they used redfish. So this was a fun article to write. It had a connection to my childhood. It did not win any prizes. I did not make $25, and although I enjoyed writing it, I was no longer making my living as a writer. But I really transitioned with this article to the real joy of writing something that I thought was substantial for our magazine. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a slide or two. So I have not done a lot of writing lately because I have gone off again to write a couple of vanity books. And what I want to do is I want to write two books. I'm in the process of writing them both. One on postcards that were postmarked in April 1945, and the other on magazines that were published in April of 1945. And so I thought I would show you a few naval-oriented postcards from the postcard book, which will be the easier book because I think I maybe have 300 or 400 postcards is all. So that one put together kind of like the Einstein book or the Patriotic Covers book will be fairly easy to do. These four postcards with a naval theme from my accumulation are what postcard collectors call linen postcards. That is, they're photographs that are hand tinted and colored, and then they're printed on a paper that's slightly corrugated or textured that some very good promoter said, let's call these linen. So you get kind of a soft feel and a soft look to them. Up in the top left, that postcard depicts a class in war orientation at the U.S. Naval Training Center in Bainbridge, Maryland. On the right is a photograph of the Naval Armory in Detroit, Michigan. I live about 40 miles from Detroit, so I had a chance to go visit the Armory, thinking, of course, it would look just like this, just like I think I might have looked if I were the same as 1945, only to learn that, like so many things in Detroit, it has fallen into a great state of disrepair. So that insert I have shows what the inside of the Naval Armory in Detroit looks like today. It looked like it once had beautiful murals, but now the ceiling is collapsing and the murals are in pretty bad shape, like a lot of things, unfortunately, in our city. On the bottom left is a dress parade at the U.S. Naval Training Center in Bainbridge, Maryland. And the one on the right depicts a naval brigade drilling near the auditorium building at the Naval Operating Base in Norfolk, Virginia. Just for the fun of it, the book also includes what I call cartoon, or what all the postcard collectors call cartoon or comic postcards. And I picked these three because they tell what I call a typical sailor's story. Sort of starting over on the left, a sailor is encouraged to have a girlfriend, or maybe more than one. And you don't tell her where you are. And national security is often a good reason for that. But you always make sure that she knows that, or they know, that you miss them very much. They should wait for you and you're coming back. So I have postcards that are linen, some postcards that are comic, and that book is kind of coming along nicely. The book that is really giving me a hard time is the one on magazines. I think I was once again not thinking right. With my Einstein book, I thought, how many Einstein stamps could there be? And I found there weren't 3 dozen, there were 400. I also thought, how many magazines could there be at the end of World War II? I thought, well, these magazines were published while we were in war. Nobody had surrendered. And how could you have magazines about tennis and chess and dogs and horses? It seemed like everybody had a magazine. I ended up having about 1,300 of these magazines that were all issued in April of 1945. And they're just fascinating. One, because they are a glance at the world that I was born into. They show things that my parents were thinking were important when I was born. And they also give a real nice perspective on the time and the war. So this is quite a job. This is going to be 1,300 and growing everyday magazines. Many of them are military magazines, and many of them are naval magazines. So I picked a half a dozen of them here that have a naval theme to them. And I thought I would show you these. In the top left-hand corner is an issue of All Hands, which was published for the Coast Guard 3rd Naval District. In the top middle is a publication called Otis Oracles, and this is a mimeograph newsletter. I expanded my definition of magazine a little bit to include these because I really love them. It's mimeographed, and it's, again, printed on very low quality paper that tanned very easily. And this was printed for the sailors and officers of the USS Otis, which was a repair ship. Over on the right is a copy of the Great Lakes Bulletin, which I particularly like because I am surrounded by the Great Lakes here in Michigan. On the bottom left is a magazine that was not published for the military. It is a magazine that was published by the employees of the Jersey Central Power and Light Company. But I wanted to show it because it shows a very dynamic picture of a ship being launched. And it also promotes war bonds by saying every submarine that is launched, it costs $5.5 million. And that is compared to probably $4 billion being the cost of a submarine today. So we have a little bit of inflation with higher quality technology. In the middle is a magazine, a copy of the Waves newsletter that was published by the Department of the Navy, and it includes information about the Women's Reserve and the United States Naval Reserve. And over on the far left, far right, is the April 20th, 1945 issue of a magazine published at the U.S. Naval Training Center in Miami, Florida, which commemorates the death 8 days before of President Roosevelt. So I guess you could say, in a sense, this is where I get to my point. My point is that all of us collect different things. And even those of us who collect, quote, the same thing, collect with a different emphasis and a different way of expressing our passion for our hobby. I think that means that all of us have an article in us, one or two, and probably even a presentation. And I hope one of the points of my presentation is if I can do this, certainly there are a lot of members in our club who can do this. So I really urge you to think about what you have, what you know, write an article for the log, send it in. People are terribly supportive and very helpful. When I published my first, quote, substantial piece, I got a nice note from Greg Finnegan, and he gave me an item that I didn't have. And just people have been terrific in our club. So think about writing something for the log. Think about giving a presentation. Again, people are very supportive, and I thank all of you for zooming in. And with that pitch, I am going to get to my 21st slide, and that will be the end.